Today we celebrate the feast of Saint Jean de Brebeuf, Isaac Jogues, and companions, and these are the secondary patrons of Canada. So the principal patron of Canada is Saint Joseph. These martyrs, these Jesuit martyrs, are the secondary patrons, and there's 8 of them in total. 6 of them were priests, and 2 were just lay helpers. I think one of them was a physician. The other one, I can't remember what he was, but they all helped, and they sacrificed their lives. They dedicated their lives to promoting the kingdom of God here on earth. So they came from France. They died in the middle of the 1600s, so roughly around 1650. They died, and at that time it was a very harsh conditions here. There was no settlements. In fact, they were the ones who established the first settlements. And part of the reason that they came is to try to evangelize the native Indians at that time. And in many ways, they were quite successful. But there were different bands or different groups of Indians, and 2 main bands at that time were the Huron Indians and the Iroquois. The Huron, they tended to stay in one place more. They tended to grow corn and various things, so they didn't move around as much. Whereas the Iroquois, they were more hunters and gatherers, but they would also attack other tribes. So they were a warrior band of Indians. And so obviously the Hurons became more favorable to the white men, and they started trading and prospering, and the Iroquois didn't like this. And at some point they decided they want to wipe out all the Hurons as well as the white men. And so they went from one village to the next, attacking and basically killing mostly the men, taking the women and the younger ones as prisoners. And when the martyrdom of Saint Jean de Brebeuf took place, he had been forewarned that they were coming. So he had an opportunity to flee, but he didn't. He remained behind with the warriors, and many of them were in the process of becoming Catholics, preparing for baptism. And so he baptized as many of them as he could, those who were willing. But he stayed behind. He wanted to be with them. And he was captured. And they knew that he was a great spiritual leader, and so they wanted to make an example of him. And part of the reason they knew that he was a great spiritual leader is partially because he was so influential with the Indians, and he manifested great love for them. They had previously captured Saint Jean de Brebeuf, and in his first captivity, they tortured him in various ways, but one of the things that they did is they gnawed off his fingers. So in other words, they just started chewing on his fingers, and they kind of took a perverse delight in this, in torturing him. And there was a woman that had also been captured with Saint Jean de Brebeuf, a Christian, and they forced her to cut off his thumb, which she eventually did. And in his memoirs or his letters back to France, he wrote that, with his good hand, he picked up his severed thumb and offered it to God. And because they had gnawed off his forefingers and cut off his thumb, at that time it was forbidden for anyone to be ordained a priest if they lacked those 2 fingers, because the essential aspect of a priest is to offer the sacrifice of the Mass. And these fingers, the thumb and the forefingers, are essential for holding the sacred host. And so, after this happened to him, he managed to escape. And instead of saying, okay, well, I've done my time, I'm kind of crippled now, please let me go back to France, he stayed on. Instead, he asked for permission for a dispensation to be able to celebrate Mass, even though he was missing his thumb and his forefingers had been gnawed down to be just stumps. And he was granted permission to do that. So as I mentioned, when they finally came, when they attacked the settlement where he was at, he stayed behind, and so he was captured. And this was in March, snow was still on the ground, so it was quite cold. So because they knew that he suffered so well, they knew he was a great spiritual leader. They recalled his first captivity, and so they wanted to make an example of him, to discourage all the other white men from coming, and to discourage the Indians, the other Indians, the Hurons, from favoring their relations with the white men. And so they stripped him. They stripped him, as I said, it was in March. They stripped him. They pulled out his fingernails and his toenails of whatever remained, and they forced him to march back to their camp. And at their camp, he had to run the gauntlet. So in other words, 2 rows of Indians line up, each one with a club or some weapon, and he has to run through, and as he runs through, they all take a strike at him. Then they tied him to a pillar, and one Indian who was enraged just started stabbing him with a sharp metal instrument, not a knife, but enough to cause fairly good damage. But they took their time in torturing him because, as I mentioned, they wanted to make an example of him. And they did a lot of things to him. So, for example, they tied bark around him and lit the bark on fire. And as his flesh burned at the same time and the bark fell off, they would cut strips from his thighs and eat it in front of him. On one occasion, they took some axe heads and they put them into the hot coals and got them red hot and strung them around with some vine and put it around his neck. And so to try to avoid the burning from the hot axe heads, he would try to lean forward or back, but he couldn't escape the pain from the searing, red hot axe heads. They also scalped him while he was still alive, and they boiled some water and poured it over his scalped head 3 times in mockery of baptism. And what's really interesting is that during this time of his torture, he continued to try to preach to them. He continued to look at them with love. And this just enraged the Indians. They couldn't stand it. And so they cut off his lips and they cut out his tongue. And they stuffed his mouth with something so that he wasn't able to speak anymore. Anyways, they sensed that his time of departure was coming, and so what they did is they cut open his chest and took out his still beating heart and ate it. And the reason they ate it is because they wanted to capture his spirit. They wanted his spiritual strength. But of course, they would never have it. And they couldn't have it. But where did Saint Jean de Brebeuf get this tremendous strength? And of course, he got it by his relationship with God. And he knew that coming to North America at the time that he did, he knew it was dangerous, not just because of the wilderness and the wild animals and, navigating the rapids and all these things, but he knew that the Indians were capable of attacking them. So he knew his life was in danger. But you see, as we read in today's gospel reading, those who want to save their life will lose it, but those who lose their life for my sake will save it. He gave his life for the sake of the North American natives, to try to evangelize them, to try to bring the message of salvation to them. And he endured all kinds of hardships, as I mentioned, but he did all these things willingly, out of love for God and out of love for his neighbor, even those who were torturing him. Now, of all the tortures, it's hard to fathom, and it's hard to kind of understand how one could endure all these things. And of course, it's because of the grace of God within you. God gives us the strength. And it's important that we remember this, because often when we're sick or suffering, we complain so much. But God is there. And if we suffer for him, he gives us the grace that we need. He gives us the strength that we need. Out of all the tortures, the one that I like to think about is they cut off his lips and cut out his tongue so that he could no longer speak to them. But he still continued to look at them with love. And the whole point is, you and I, well, we've got our lips, we've got our tongues, but how do we use it? How do we use our lips and our tongues? Do we use it to say good things? Do we use it to gossip, to put people down, to take God's name in vain, or to say inappropriate words or inappropriate jokes? Do we use it to proclaim the goodness of God? Are we willing to lay down our lives? Are we willing to make sacrifices for the sake of others who perhaps, they know far more than these Indians of old did, and yet they still do not know the message of salvation? What are we willing to do? What are we willing to risk? What are we willing to suffer to bring the message of salvation to those around us? Let us ask St. Jean de Brebeuf, St. Isaac Jogues, and all their companions to intercede on our behalf.